Hey all here OS Reviews, you're watching our hands-on review of the Dragon Touch K10. This is a budget Android tablet that, as the name implies, has a 10-inch display, and it sells for just $100. So what specs do you get for just a $100 tablet? Well, we have a quad-core processor, we also have an IPS display, although the resolution is just HD quality. It has 2 gigabytes of built-in RAM and 16 gigs of built-in storage, which again, a little bit on the low side, but for just basic video streaming and some light web browsing, I think it will suffice. Even though tablets aren't as popular as they once were and our phones are getting larger and larger, having a dedicated unit like this, especially one which has a 10-inch display or above, is still kind of a middle ground between a larger laptop and a smaller smartphone. So with something like this, it might be good for reading some textbooks, ebooks, things like that. Now here's a quick user manual. It's actually pretty dense. It's in full color. We have a micro USB cable for charging and a AC power adapter. There seems like there is a pre-applied screen protector. Let's just peel off the front layer here. The first impressions as we are proceeding through setup is the build quality has improved significantly compared to sub $100 tablets from just 1 year or 2 years ago. So if we look at the base here, this is actually made out of real metal. So it feels very cool to the touch, surprisingly hefty in the hands, and feels actually very quality for something with low-end specs. Now the top and bottom are still made out of plastic, so very similar to a Xiaomi Redmi device. It's used for the antenna bands. We have the camera. There is also a built-in LED flash as well, which is actually pretty rare on the tablet, even though it's only 2 megapixels for the sensor. And we have stereo speakers as well. And then on the right-hand spine, we have access to a 3.5mm headphone jack, a dedicated volume rocker, a power on-off key. The top houses a micro USB port for charging and a micro HDMI port. That's something I haven't seen in a long time, but allows you to connect it to a monitor directly for video output. So taking a closer look at its performance, starting with the display, in general I find it to be a good panel for the price, with good viewing angles and solid overall color reproduction. It also gets decently bright when you're taking it outdoors if you want to crank up the maximum brightness. The only downside is, again, the resolution isn't the highest, but that's debatable. The plus side is there's less pixels to push around, so it's going to be a little bit easier on the MediaTek chipset here, which is a pretty entry-level chip, so you're going to see less stuttering as a result. It's not a laminated display, so there's still a slight gap between the glass on the top and the display underneath. So if you point it at the light just right, you can see there's a bit more of a depth there. We are running on a very stock install of Android 8.1 Oreo, so it's fairly up to date, and there's all the gestures like pulling up to access the full drawer for your applications. You can see there's no bloatware at all. There's just the standard Google utilities, access to Gmail, YouTube, Google Photos, and of course the Play Store to download more apps and content. The only slight strange thing though is that some of the text and icons are a little on the large side. So if we pull down the notification shade, you can see that it takes up a large width. I think part of the reason is because of that 720p resolution, so the pixels are more spread apart on a larger screen, but nonetheless it still works quite well. What's also kind of neat, as aforementioned in our unboxing, is there is an LED flashlight on the back that assists the camera under low light situations, and you can also use it as a torch if you really need to. Now, talking about the battery life ever so slightly, 5,000 milliamp hours is actually a pretty good size. In my testing, I was able to get over 6 hours of screen on time with some casual web browsing and some YouTube video playback. So let's take a close look at the camera first. All I can say is it's functional, but it's not a very fancy camera. It's probably best suited for scanning in documents, but you probably shouldn't use it as your primary device. So if we take a look at some samples here, again, for document scanning, it does all right. You can still make out all the letters. Otherwise, if you are outdoors, it also is okay, but if the lights are really dim, you can see it definitely struggles a lot more. Let's take a quick look at the speakers and video streaming from YouTube next. Pausing things there, takeaway is the speakers do get pretty loud, and it's definitely a stereo pair, so better than a mono speaker, but it is quite tinny sounding. I would definitely prefer using your own headphones since it has a standard 3.5mm plug, or you can use Bluetooth if you want to improve the audio quality. I would say for watching some quick YouTube videos, it's perfectly fine, but it's definitely missing a little bit in terms of bass. Now I can also do multitasking, split screen, just by long holding on the bottom key here, so I can maybe bring up both the camera as well as take a look at, again, YouTube on the side here. So this is baked into Android Oreo by default, and everything still feels pretty smooth as far as the navigation is concerned with these two apps open side by side there. Right now it's loading back the desktop site of The Verge, and you can see it's actually doing a really good job. All of the content seems to be loading along just fine, including the ads and video content. Some parts are taking a few seconds longer than on maybe a flagship smartphone, but in general it still is a good enough experience, and overall still pretty smooth when it comes to the general browsing and scrolling around. The full desktop version of CNET loading here, and you can see it's also doing a pretty good job, even though it's another very complex page. Now if we jump into settings very quickly here, you can see indeed it is running on Android Oreo 8.1. In terms of gestures, you can double tap the power key to jump into the camera, and for security you can set up your own PIN, but it doesn't have a fingerprint scanner like more expensive tablets. When it comes to apps, you can download any program from the Play Store. You can see it just loads up really quickly here. Scrolling still feels quite smooth, especially if we keep the apps open to a minimum here in the background. Whether that's productivity tools like Word, Excel, PowerPoint for doing some quick productivity on the go, you can connect this to a Bluetooth keyboard and it works pretty well. Or you can of course download some quick games. So I'd recommend lighter titles like Stack, maybe some puzzle games, retro emulators, anything that's a little lighter, and it will run it back without any problems. Plus it will take up less space to install as well. Loading things along, you can see it's not going to be quite as fast in terms of frame rates as maybe a flagship phone, the latest Snapdragon processor, but overall for a budget device it works quite well. Once the game itself is open, you can see it's still quite smooth and responsive as far as interaction is concerned. The touchscreen is very sensitive, does support up to 5 points for multi-touch, so no problems at all in terms of just regular gameplay, as you can see here. Other things to keep in mind is that during gaming, it actually does remain quite cool. I think part of the reason is because it has an aluminum construction. Coupled with a less powerful processor, it actually is pretty energy efficient, so it doesn't really thermal throttle or anything like that, which is great. So you can still use it for, let's say, hours on end, video streaming, doing some light gaming, and it never gets really hot or uncomfortable to use. So that's more or less it for our hands-on review of the Dragon Touch K10. For only $100, I would say it's actually a pretty decent option to consider if you do want something that's low cost, but actually has a very good construction quality, being made out of aluminum, and pretty surprisingly good performance for such a low-end device in terms of the specs. I would say that the quality has definitely improved significantly compared to tablets that we used to see for only $100 or so. Its closest competitor is still the aforementioned Amazon Fire 10. However, the Fire 10 does have Fire OS, so if you aren't already invested in Amazon's ecosystem, you want something that is more stock because you want to try out your own games and titles and customize the tablet, this might be something that's a little bit easier to pick up and immediately start using. It also has a physical HDMI port on the top that you can connect using a wire to an HD TV to decrease the latency. So certainly is one of the better options as far as budget tablets go for under $100. You can check out more details if interested in the links down below, but for now that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been the Dragon Touch K10.